Hey everybody, it's Norm from Tested, and today I'll be reviewing the PlayStation VR2, PSVR2, launching next week. This is a review unit that Sony sent me that I've been testing for the past week, almost 1 week, and today we'll be covering the hardware, the game experiences I've had access to so far, and how this headset compares not only to the first PlayStation VR, but also the other headsets on the market today, whether they're standalone headsets like the Meta Quest 2 or tethered PC VR experiences, and really who this headset is for. So let's dive in. We're going to start things off talking about the form factor and ergonomics. So this is a tethered VR headset. It plugs into the PS5 via one USB-C cable. So comparably, it's very similar to the kind of tethered VR experience you'd get using a headset like the Valve Index or the HP Reverb. This is not like a Meta Quest 2 or even Meta Quest Pro or even the upcoming HTC Vive Elite XR Elite, in that it's not running a system-on-a-chip processor. All the game processing is done on the PS5, and that means that the important parts of this headset are the display, the optics, the comfort and fit, and its audio solution. So form factor-wise, actually is using the same kind of halo headband strap as the first PSVR, and I like this design. It's comfortable all the way around, has an extendable head strap where you press this button, extends out, and then as it clamps around your head, you can tighten it using a ratcheting dial in the back. You feel the headset pressure on the back of your head as well as on the top of your forehead, and I do think it's balanced enough because, like I said, there's no battery on the inside of this, that it doesn't feel like you have a lot of front-heavy weight, which some people using like Meta Quest Pro have had over long durations, because that one does have a lot of hardware on that standalone headset. It weighs just under 600 grams, so the first PSVR was right at 600 grams, not including the cable. Sony says this weighs 560, but putting it on a scale, holding the cable up, read to me is 590 grams, which is still much lighter than, for example, a fully kitted out Quest 2 with Elite head strap and custom facial interface. But really is about that balance, and the big win here is the setup. Setting the PSVR 2 up is just a complete generational difference than that clunky setup that you had with the first PlayStation VR. If you don't recall, PSVR 1 required that you buy the headset, which was $400 in itself. They had a bundle that included the PlayStation Eye as well as the Move controllers, but those were dated technologies that they kind of bootstrapped onto the headset. It plugged into the PS4 and the PS4 Pro and still works with the PS5 using a bunch of breakout boxes. In fact, you can still see on the cables numbered instructions of like what to plug in first. And it worked, but it also meant that getting it set up became a cumbersome task. And for a lot of reasons, this sat in the drawer for a couple of years. I mean, it's been a couple of years since it's launched as well. Sony obviously took that to note, designed the PS5 with this in mind. In the front of the PS5, there is a USB Type-A port and as well as a USB Type-C port. The Type-C port is what you plug that into, single cable. It's about 4.5 meters long, so over 14 feet long, and that's plenty for sitting close to your entertainment center. It really depends on what your gaming setup is. In my living room, even though I have the TV and the PlayStation right up front, I'm not sitting with this on the couch. I'm sitting it kind of adjacent or maybe on the floor or standing in the area in the carpet in front of the TV with plenty of space to do a little bit of moving around, definitely for standing experiences with free locomotion. Nothing I tried required a large room scale area, though as you're setting this up, it does ask that you have a 6.7 foot by 6.7 foot play area if you want to do full room scale. The setup process also now doesn't require any cameras looking in. It's inside-out tracking. So in the front of the PSVR2, there are 4 cameras. This allows for the positional tracking of the headset, as well as the recognition of the new Sense VR controllers, which we'll talk about. And it also allows for much higher resolution pass-through. It is a grayscale pass-through, and the setup was actually very impressive. And the very first thing you do is you put on the headset and you look around your room, and it does kind of a mapping of the room. There's some cool visualizations that show that it's recognizing your walls, ceilings, and floors. And then after that, you can do some precision calibration, either using the controllers to touch the floor or using the thumbstick to set your height, as well as expanding or marking out where your guardian area is, where the boundaries are, so you don't knock into your couch. It doesn't do any kind of automatic guardian detection where it recognizes objects and scenes, so it doesn't know where your TV is, doesn't know where your coffee table is or your couch is. It still just is kind of this nebulous play space that you're generating, which then becomes that safe area to play. There's a button on the bottom of the headset that you can press anytime. It's a function button. By default, by pressing it once, you go into your pass-through view, so you can see the world, again, in a relatively high-resolution stereo grayscale, but you can also reprogram that as well to mute your microphone. So it's a power button, which you can hold down to boot up the headset, and that activates the rumble motor on the headset, its head strap itself, and then you're in-game, so you're in the experience. You're putting on the headset, and you see a floating representation of the PlayStation home menu. From here, if you're not interested in playing full VR games, and we'll talk about the game selection, you can enter a cinematic mode. So any game that you would be able to play on your TV, you can actually play in a virtual display in headset. You could do that as well in the PSVR1. It was one of, I think, the best features. Here, the implementation is a little bit different because this is not a mirrored video connection. You don't get both the video on a TV as well as video in headset if you're using the cinematic mode, if you have that floating flat screen. So it's useful, for example, if someone in your house wants to play a different game console or watch something on TV, you can still be in headset playing God of War, Astrobot, Spider-Man, whatever you have in your PS library. You can customize the brightness as well as the size of that cinematic mode screen. And I found that the size changing was kind of interesting because there are 2 ways to think about the screen size. You can think about a set distance of a large TV and how far you're moving it close or further away from you, or you could think of it about having difference between having like a 36-inch monitor versus a 77-inch monitor. Bigger screens, but kind of in a fixed position. The way I experienced the screen size change, it definitely felt like a large screen that's even moved closer to you or further away as I changed that scaling, which meant that in this largest size, it did fill my entire peripheral vision, but I felt that it was too close. And I found a sweet spot for me was a little bit past 50% in that cinematic mode. Other adjustments on the headset, like PSVR 1, one of my favorite things is there is facial relief here. So the gasket is this soft silicone. It doesn't really press against your face. It's very loose fitting. Same with the nose flap here. And what you do is you press that top button as you put this on, and you can slide it closer to your face, which not only gets you a tighter fit and blocks out more outside light, but also gives you as wide of a field of view as possible. It also means that with my glasses, I can wear this in headset, no problem. I can press the headset as close to my glasses as possible. I recommend still looking at aftermarket options for prescription lenses as those become available, because the thing you don't want to do is have your glasses lenses rub against the interior Fresnel lenses. That can scuff them up. I've done it before many times with other headsets. It's not something you want to do, but you can wear glasses in this really comfortably. And you can adjust the facial relief as well if you don't want the full widest field of view, or if you're extending it out and drinking a cup of coffee or soda or something. That works well also. Also new to PSVR2 is finally IPD adjustment. And so there's a dial here, and because this headset, the optics and displays are two separate discrete panels rather than one single 1080p panel. That was the case with the first PSVR, that you can have a granular IPD adjustment. I don't have an exact range of what that IPD adjustment is, but for me, my IPD is 68, and I was able to find a pretty good sweet spot, as well as extending pretty far beyond that, wider beyond that. So I wouldn't be surprised if this comfortably gets people in the 70, 71 IPD as well. There is an in-headset visualization to help you find that IPD, but surprisingly, they don't show a number. So a lot of PCVR headsets, as you adjust the IPD, you see that distance indicated below. Here, there is no distance, and so it kind of makes it difficult if you're constantly putting on the headset and taking it off to find that sweet spot every single time, because you don't know where the dial is. You kind of have to tinker with it until your eyes finally see everything pretty clearly. There also is much better built-in audio. Well, not really built-in, but audio options with PSVR2. Unlike with other headsets, Valve Index, Quest 2, Quest Pro, there's no speakers on the headset itself. They don't have kind of the off-ear headphones. What you have, though, is bundled in the box a way to plug in these earbuds. Now, if you recall the first PSVR, you also had to use their bundled earbuds, but you plug them into a port that was on the tethered cable. It was a cumbersome system. You would fumble over plugging it in. Most people just use headphones. Even using headphones, you get tangled in the wires. Thankfully, Sony has addressed that with PSVR 2, and there's this interesting custom headphone attachment that plugs into two places. There's a soft plug here on one side just to lock it in place, and then actually a 3.5 millimeter jack on the other side, and then the earbuds just dangle here. I found this a very easy to use solution. The headphones come with 3 different sizes of tips, so it works great for mine using the small tips, and I didn't feel the need to use over-the-head earphones, although you could use those as well, plug them in over the 3.5 millimeter jack, or use Bluetooth headphones like the one Sony sells. And then finally, the controllers. So these are the DualSense VR controllers that have, I think, a really interesting design. There's your classic tracking ring. I think there are 12 IR LEDs on the inside that the headset can see. But unlike, the Quest 2 controllers, the tracking ring isn't in front of where your hand is. It actually is a larger ring, and it's recessed to closer to where your wrist is, which I think allows for better tracking, and which means you can get the controllers closer together in the front without worrying about knocking into each other or occlusion. And button-wise, you have your standard thumbsticks. There are 2 action buttons on the top. You have a PlayStation button on both of the sides that gets you into the menu, a button that's a menu button that you can also depress to realign, and then your trigger and grips. The grips here are the only things I didn't like so much because they are a single tap grip with not a lot of travel at all. They're not analog. And the triggers are adaptive triggers, much like you'd find in the DualSense controllers. 1 stage, not 2 stage triggers here, but they do have resistance and really nice tactile feedback. There are also capacitive sensors on the triggers, the grips, as well as the top 2 buttons and the thumbstick. So there's pose recognition. So in upcoming social applications, or even in some of the launch titles here, that you'll be able to recognize some basic gestures, your thumbs up, your peace signs. And I found it comparable to what you'd find in the first generation Quest and Quest 2, but there's no full hand tracking here. So you're going to be using these controllers or playing a game using the DualSense PlayStation controller. One thing that I wish was an option here that they had to let go of because they're not using the PlayStation Eye is there is no tracking of the DualSense or here DualSense Edge controllers at all. Some of my favorite games in PSVR1, like Astrobot or even Super Hypercube, was great because you didn't have to use the Move controllers. You could use the DualShock controllers, and because that had the light in the front, it was actually recognized positionally by that PlayStation Eye. Here, if you're playing a cinematic mode game, for example, using the DualSense controller, you don't see a representation of this, which I think is a little bit of a bummer. It's a missed opportunity, and it kind of narrows the input options for VR experiences to these new DualSense VR controllers. Not bad, but there's no button parity here between this. You can't use these controllers as a direct replacement for your DualSense controllers because you still need your D-pad, you still need the 4 buttons on the right side, and so you have to use one or the other. I just wish that the DualSense controllers could be tracked somehow. Maybe a future version, or they're going to put some LED lights on here. I don't know. The motion controllers here also don't feel too heavy, thankfully, and they charge via a USB-C cable, although Sony does sell a charging dock that allows you to plug in a USB-C adapter, and then you just drop that into the charging dock. Battery life on controllers for me was about 4.5 hours, 5 hours. Basically about 2 play sessions. Looking at the in-UI battery indicator, those 3 bars, after about 2 hours of play, it dropped down to 2 bars, another hour and a half or so dropped down to 1 bar, and so it's kind of the story with the PS5 era of controllers, battery life not so great. You want to throw this on to the dock or plug it into USB-C and charge it overnight. And unfortunately, you cannot charge it and play at the same time. So if you plug this into USB-C, have a battery pack, it won't charge. You'll still be able to see the controller in headset only when it recognizes when there's no motion and you're not in a game, will then start charging. I also found that the haptics, while they're effective in games like Horizon Call of the Mountain or something like Kayak VR, you can actually feel nice sensitive rumbles when you're moving your stick and hitting objects. It wasn't as granular or kind of world-changing and groundbreaking as I found the DualSense haptics. Playing the Astrobot game that comes with the PS5 and being able to recognize what type of surface you're walking the Astrobot over, you don't feel that kind of nuance at least I didn't feel that kind of nuance using these controllers. And maybe that's developers not tapping into the motors and the haptics here as much with this launch lineup. But even the rumble on the headset wasn't a big game changer to me. They're more subtle cues, and the biggest thing is, when you're pressing the power button, you can hear that rumble, but it wasn't something that I felt like was a completely groundbreaking experience. Tracking fidelity-wise, I think it's great. I think it's kind of what you expect from an modern inside-out tracking system, where I never lost tracking on the headset. I tried it in a bunch of different rooms, so with open windows, with nice lighting, dimmer lighting, and I was able to navigate those environments pretty well. You have the option of doing seated experience, standing experience, changing that boundary, that guardian boundary, and then recognizing the controllers, I'd say very comparable to what you find in the Quest 2. I did find moving the controllers maybe a little bit close to my face. I noticed some drift on them, and I do find a little bit of occlusion if I'm holding them in a specific pose, but never did I find that when I move the controller out to the peripheral of my field of view, was I losing any of that tracking. Also, none of the experiences were like a Beat Saber type experience where I would be waving them wildly outside my field of view either. So definitely good enough, and tracking was not an issue with any of the experiences I played. Speaking of tracking though, something that's new to PSVR2 is it does have eye tracking. Very interesting that PlayStation and Sony decided to include eye tracking with this headset. It's implemented in a couple of ways. You do a little bit of calibration in the headset, look at your standard look at moving dots, and then it can recognize not only where you're gazing, but whether your eyes are closed. There's a nice interface element where you can see whether you're blinking or not. And in a game like Horizon Call of the Mountain, you can use that gaze tracking to navigate menus. And very quickly, I found this much preferred over your standard kind of head-tracked pointer. So in classic VR, maybe you're moving your head as a pointer to select icons, and you can turn off gaze tracking at any time to do that. I found it so much easier and so much more intuitive and natural to just use my eyes to move the cursor. And it wasn't a wildly moving cursor. They do smooth it out to highlight items in a menu option. In game, though, the biggest benefit of eyes tracking and gaze tracking is foveated rendering. So this is something that was really interesting to test. It's the idea that knowing where your eyes are looking, the system can render objects outside or in your periphery in a lower fidelity, whether it's lower resolution, lower textures, but in lower detail because you don't need to see all that detail in your periphery. So in headset, turning that on, it was something I didn't notice, right? Because I'm looking where I'm looking, I couldn't tell what outside my center of focus was changing in image quality. But because it does mirror in VR mode what you see off of one of your eyes onto your TV, I was able to test with some outside assistance the foveated rendering. And it actually does work. So in a game like Kayak VR, if I'm looking at the beach ball and I'm focusing right in the center of it, then that beach ball is going to look perfectly smooth, no aliasing. But as soon as I dart my eyes either to the far left, far right, up or down, you can actually see that very quickly that beach ball, the jaggies start appearing. The aliasing on that circle starts appearing. And not only was that in Kayak VR, but also in Horizon Call of the Mountain, something that was very noticeable to spectators was that foveated rendering. I could point my hand and say, I'm actually gazing here. My head's held still. My eyes are looking to the right, and they would say, wow, the objects to the left definitely look more blurry. Now, what that performance improvement generates, though, that's harder to test. And turning gaze tracking off, I also wasn't able to notice a massive performance decrease. So maybe it's running the system more efficiently, maybe it's generating more consistent frame rates, but it wasn't like turning on foveated rendering suddenly allowed the difference between 90 hertz rendering and 120 hertz rendering. Most of the time I could still tell when something was running at 120 hertz, they were using reprojection, and you can see the kind of telltale signs of an image being rendered actually at 60 hertz, then doubled over to 120 hertz. All right, let's talk about optics and image quality. What you've been waiting for, what people have been waiting for. So it's using two separate panels here. They are 2000 by 2040 resolution each, and these are OLED panels like they use with the first PSVR with an RGB substrate, so it's not pentile subpixel arrangement. It's going to be high pixel fill, not necessarily no screen door effect, but you don't notice the space between the pixels. Now, if you follow VR, you know it's not about resolution, it's not about necessarily even the pixels per inch of the panel, it's about pixels per degree, which is how dense the pixels are, how dense the image quality is relative to the field of view. Here, the field of view is rated at 110 degrees diagonally, so that's up from 100 degrees in the PSVR1 and up from the 90 or so degrees of the Quest 2 and the Meta Quest Pro and the current generation of headsets using pancake lenses. And so we're starting to see these trade-offs between types of panel and types of optics in modern day VR. Sony here is using, like I said, an OLED panel, two OLED panels, and using Fresnel optics, which means that gives them that slightly wider field of view. But with that wide field of view, and that's what you get if you use press the headset right up to your face, the pixels per degree here are basically around 19 pixels per degree, so less than the PPD of the Quest 2 and the Meta Quest Pro, although the rendering here is made up for because you're running the full processing power of a gaming PC, basically, a PS5. So it's not running off of a mobile chipset. So you're getting games that are running closer to native resolution or have higher resolution textures. It's not doing scaling. And so even though the pixels per degree might be lower than the Quest 2, I actually found the image quality much nicer than that of the Quest 2. Doing comparison in Demio, for example, looking at Demio in a Quest 2 versus in the PSVR2, holding up those cards in front of me, the text looked almost exactly the same. What was different though was with the PSVR2 being an OLED, the black levels were pitch black, the colors look so vibrant, and the brightness is maybe the best part of the display system here. Sony calls them HDR. I wouldn't say it's as high quality as HDR as like a nice OLED TV. So I have an LG OLED TV, and playing God of War in that in full HDR versus in cinematic mode in headset here, I'm still going to prefer the full 4K resolution of my actual TV. But in headset, comparing to other mobile headsets, desktop headsets, the brightness is noticeable, and it is really vibrant. Using the image that you see here, these are two photos taken with a camera with the same exposure settings, same shutter, same ISO between the Quest 2 and PSVR 2, and PSVR 2 much, much brighter. It is a noticeable quality of life improvement. But there are trade-off. So because they're using Fresnel lenses, there are some God rays. I'd say less than that what I've noticed in the Quest 2. So whatever optical stack they're using, diminish some of those, even with pitch black screens and really bright logos and icons. Noticeable, that glare, but not distracting, not as bad as what you'd see in like the Valve Index, for example. And I did notice Mira. So Mira is the effect of the screen looking a little bit dirty. And you notice this in like gray screens. So when the screen is kind of really near pitch black and dark gray, sometimes it looks like, not chromatic aberration, but looks like this almost discolored grime that's on the screen. If you look for it, it's there. Wasn't distracting in vast majority of games, especially bright games, but do notice it in some dark scenes. And then finally, the sweet spot for these optics. And we're going to talk about these in two different ways. There's the eye box, which is how big of a volume of a sweet spot there is for your eyes relative to the lenses. So how much adjustment do you need to do to find that sweet spot? And here I think the eye box is kind of small, so which is why that IPD adjustment is necessary. And a good fit into your head is necessary. I did find sometimes the headset jostled left or right. I did have to adjust it because once my eyes move out of alignment with that eye box, things start looking blurry fast. In terms of the sweet spot of visuals, once you are in that eye box though, it is a pretty wide sweet spot. Not as wide as what you get out of pancake optics, like in the Quest Pro, but here it's a relatively wide sweet spot. You do notice some of that chromatic aberration and some of the blurring near the periphery on the outside. But I do think, combined with that brightness of these panels and the true black levels, it's a better image quality overall than a Quest 2. I did want to take a moment to talk about this cable and the image quality you get out of a tethered VR experience. Now, if you have a Quest, you know you can plug that into your PC over the USB cable and get the Link experience, a PC VR experience over a Quest Link. But that is image compression. So what's happening there is your video card is taking these images and compressing them and then sending them over a data connection at a very high bit rate, something that you can maybe customize. And you can sometimes notice the artifacts of that in the image compression, sometimes in some of the reprojection and the latency, which isn't how the first couple generations of VR headsets worked if you plugged it in over an HDMI or DisplayPort connection. I think, and Sony hasn't been clear about this, but this is a DisplayPort connection. And this USB-C is using USB-C with either DisplayPort Alt or Sony's own protocol. The way I was able to suss that out, I plugged in my Nreal Airs right into this port, and I was able to get audio, not video. So I think there's some type of encryption, but audio, which you wouldn't be able to do just plugging in like USB headphones. So I do think it's using more than just the USB-C data connection. It's in some kind of DisplayPort Alt mode, which gives them more lanes in this connection for image quality. And in headset, I didn't notice any of that telltale image compression of in any high quality game, no latency, no reprojection artifacts. This feels like a true PSVR style tethered gaming experience in all the best ways possible. And the fact that this is just that single USB-C cable, it's kind of fulfilling the promise of Virtual Link. Remember that standard that VR headsets makers try to adopt, where you could just plug a USB-C display link cable right into your video card and have data, power, and video. You're getting that here in the PS5 and PSVR2. All right, let's talk about the games and experiences. And here's where I think, compared to the PSVR1 launch, Sony fell a little bit short here. First of all, there aren't many exclusives to PSVR2. At launch here, they say they're working on 100 games and titles in this launch window, but really there's about half dozen games that are going to be unique to PSVR2. One is Horizon Call of the Mountain, set in the Horizon universe, developed by Guerrilla Games, and that is a launch title, full $60 title. The other two are ports, so Gran Turismo 7, GT7, as well as Resident Evil Village, both have full VR ports also on launch day. Fortunately, it's not launch day yet, and reviewers don't have access to those VR patches, so I'm unable to test GT7 and Resident Evil Village, even though I really want to play both of those in VR. There's also Switchback VR and Fantavision VR that are exclusive to PSVR2, but their flagship is Horizon Call of the Mountain. Think of this as their Half-Life Alyx, which I'm also shocked isn't a part of this launch lineup. Sony, Valve, get it done. It is a full game. So Call of the Mountain isn't, I was afraid it was going to be kind of like a tech demo, 2 to 3 hour experience, showcasing some of the controllers, some of the functionality. No, there's a full story here. It's about 6 hours to beat. You don't play as Aloy, but you do play in that world. And the best way to describe it is it's kind of like Crytek's The Climb. It's a climbing game primarily. You're traversing the world through locomotion, whether it's swinging your arms or free locomotion, but you're really getting around doing these rock climbing maneuvers, in which you're grabbing, you're using pickaxes, you're sliding through ropes, and it's quite fun, the traversal. Interspersed with a lot of interesting evasion and combat, so a few puzzles to solve, not terribly difficult, and the action is, I think, really suited for VR. It's not open world action, which I know a lot of people were wanting and maybe concerned about, but it's this circle strafe actions where you have your bow or a slingshot, you're changing between arrows, and you're fighting these giant mechanical beasts that look incredibly awesome in VR scale. So you're circling around, maybe 3 or 4 of these robots are coming at you, and you're using your strafing to dodge their attacks and your weapons to target their specific armor parts. So location damage on all the enemies, which end up being really fun and pretty challenging as well. I don't think it pushes the limits of the kind of tension and immersion that VR can really bring. So it does hold your hand a little bit, and it's pretty welcoming, I think, for new VR users. But in terms of visual fidelity and scope of the game, it is well worth it, I think, as a launch title for PSVR2. But the other couple dozen games or so are really ports of games available already on other platforms, whether on Steam VR or in the Quest store. And some games that were on Quest only and now have made it in a kind of a remastered mode for PSVR, yeah, they look great, but it's nothing that for someone who's already experienced VR, already has a Quest, maybe already has a Valve Index, you're not getting a lot of extra value out of adopting this new VR platform, which might be okay if Sony knows that, like with PSVR1, they're really going for core gamers who have the console and maybe don't have an alternative VR headset. But the landscape has kind of changed since PSVR1. A lot of people did buy the Quest 2 over the past couple holidays, and they maybe tried PSVR 1 and were okay with it. There were a couple hundred games that came out for that. So selling PSVR 2 to people who were VR curious might be a harder sell this time. And compared to the first PSVR's launch lineup, it does feel like there's less effort this time around in creating novel experiences unique to PSVR 2. You're not getting that free PSVR worlds. There's no Astrobot on this system yet. And even the developers they've worked with, no one's really, because a lot are working off of ports maybe, no one's really tapped into all of the features of this headset, of the controllers, of that eye tracking, I feel like, at this launch. There isn't a great showcase of that stuff outside of Call of the Mountain, which is that singular title, and wouldn't call it necessarily a system seller. An essential game, yes, if you have the headset, but not a game that's good enough to warrant going out and buying a PS5 in addition to spending $550 on a PSVR 2. So as we wrap things up, there are really a couple different audiences out there who may be watching this, who I have different recommendations for. If you are a PS5 owner and you don't have a VR headset, and maybe you didn't get PSVR 1, or maybe you did, this is going to be kind of a great mid-generation upgrade to the PS5. I mean, the PS4 and PSVR 2 had several hundred games by end of life, and it's unlikely Sony's going to come out with another VR headset for the PS5. So this is it, and getting in on this early, you're going to be able to get all the new games and follow the whole generation of PSVR. All that quality of life improvements, the improved image quality, tracking, ease of setup makes this just a leaps and bounds generational leap over that first PSVR. Now, if you have a VR headset, like you might have a Quest 2, or you might be curious about moving into like a PC VR space, I'd say you could probably hold off. Look at what games are announced in the coming months. Look at what games might come out toward the holiday season before thinking about buying a PS5, which are now more widely available just for the PSVR 2. And if you are a big VR enthusiast and you have all the headsets and you are playing PC VR, I think you probably hold off as well. I mean, this is not a headset that's going to work in PC VR. By all accounts, because of the way it's doing its tracking and all the proprietary technology, there's no way that someone's going to be able to reverse engineer putting this and plugging it into a PC. And so you're locked into PS5, and that money might better be spent with another PC VR headset, because there are so many other games also on that platform, on Steam VR. So really, it does come down to those games and experiences. And GT7, Resident Evil Village, maybe going forward, Sony instructs developers to make their flat screen games with VR in mind for VR ports. If that becomes a trend, then I could absolutely see this taking off. But the thing that has made consoles so strong over the past couple of decades compared to maybe a PC option are the exclusives, are the unique experiences that are allowed by those consoles. And at launch right now, there are just not enough of those, I think. I think the hardware is solid and it's great. I've been having a great time with it, and the ease of setup is amazing. But I'm still waiting for those games. Come on, Astrobot, where are you? I need you in PSVR2. But thank you so much for watching. If you have questions about the headset, please post them in the comments below. But I will see you next time. Bye.